The town of Millridge, Wyoming, settled itself into the folds of the land like a man settling into an old coat. It was a place of practical angles and unpainted timber, its main street a wide, rutted artery that turned to thick mud in the spring and baked to iron-hard dust in the summer. In the autumn of 1884, the air carried the sharp, clean scent of pine from the surrounding hills, and the fainter, earthier smell of curing hay from the ranches that dotted the high plains. The sounds were of wagon wheels on hard-packed dirt, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer, and the low murmur of commerce from the general store. Amid the grays and browns of the town, Mae Calloway's flower shop was a small, defiant splash of color. It was not a grand establishment. It was a narrow building tucked between the land office and the mercantile, its large front window kept clean and its door always propped open in fair weather. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp soil, green stems, and the sweet, complex perfume of whatever was in season. Mae arranged them not in stiff, formal poses, but in loose, natural collections in simple clay pots and glass jars. It was a quiet business, one that catered to life's margins, a few blooms for a church service, a single stem for a young man to press between the pages of a book, a somber wreath for a new grave. Mae herself was a woman who seemed to blend into the quiet textures of her shop. She was not old, but she possessed a stillness that could be mistaken for it. Her hands, often stained with a bit of earth at the knuckles, were deft and certain as they trimmed stems or tied a length of twine around a paper-wrapped bundle. She had come to Millridge 5 years prior, a widow with little to her name but a small inheritance and a deep, abiding knowledge of things that grew. She had built her life here, one root at a time, and it was a solitary life, but not an unhappy one. She observed the town through her front window, learning its rhythms, its small dramas, and its steady, beating heart. Eli Harmon was part of that rhythm. He was a rancher from the hill country east of town, a man as solid and quiet as the land he worked. He was made of the same materials as the landscape-weathered skin, steady blue eyes that held the vastness of the sky, hands that were calloused and capable from handling horses and mending fences. He, too, was a creature of routine, and his most steadfast routine involved Mae's shop. Every Friday, for 3 years, he had appeared in her doorway. He never arrived at the same time. Sometimes the morning sun was just clearing the rooftops. Other times the afternoon was already slanting toward evening. But it was always Friday. He would step inside, his large frame seeming to fill the small space, and remove his hat. His hair was the color of sun-bleached wheat, and it was often rumpled. He would stand for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the buckets of flowers, his expression unreadable. Then he would speak, his voice a low, calm rumble. "A bunch of the wild ones, if you please, Mistress Calloway." He never wanted roses or carnations or anything that felt cultivated. He always chose the wildflowers, the Indian paintbrush, the bluebells, the asters and lupine that Mae gathered herself from the hillsides or bought from children who knew the best patches. She would select a good mix, her fingers moving with practiced ease, and wrap them in a sheet of brown paper, tying them with a simple piece of string. He would place the coins on the counter. Never more, never less. There would be a quiet exchange. "Thank you, Mistress Calloway." "Mr. Harmon." And he would be gone, the small bell above the door giving a final, soft chime. He would walk back up the main street, the bright spray of flowers, a stark contrast against his dusty work clothes, and turn east, toward the low hill where the town cemetery lay under a handful of old, wind-bent pines. Mae had watched this ritual for 156 Fridays. She had watched him in the drenching rains of April, his shoulders hunched against the wet. She had watched him in the breathless heat of July, a line of sweat tracing its way down his temple. She had watched him trudge through the first snows of November, his boots leaving deep, solitary tracks. And she never knew why. The town had its stories, of course. Millridge was too small a place for a man's grief to remain a secret. She knew he was a widower. His wife, Ruth, had been taken by a fever a few years back, not long after they had settled their claim. People said he had been devoted to her. They said her loss had quieted something in him. But the town's stories were broad strokes. They did not explain the specificity of the gesture. The wildflowers. Every single Friday, Mae found herself thinking about it at odd hours. She would be cleaning a bucket and wonder what Ruth had been like. She would be locking the door at night and picture Eli standing on that windswept hill. The gesture was too consistent, too personal to be mere habit. It was a conversation. And for 3 years, Mae had been the silent, unwitting purveyor of its vocabulary. On a Friday in late October, when the air had a brittle edge and the last of the golden aspen leaves clung to their branches, Eli Harmon came in as usual. He stood before the buckets, which held the hardier late-season blooms, deep purple asters, resilient yarrow, and the last of the black-eyed Susans. He looked tired. There were new lines around his eyes that Mae had not noticed before. "A bunch of the wild ones, if you please, Mistress Calloway." She gathered them, her movements slow and deliberate. She chose the brightest of the yellows, the deepest of the purples. As she laid them on the paper, she felt a question rise in her throat, a question that had been sitting there for months, for years. It felt like an intrusion, a violation of the quiet space they had maintained for so long. But suddenly, the silence felt heavier than the question. She tied the twine and did not immediately push the bouquet across the counter. She kept her hands on it, her gaze on her own fingers. "Mr. Harmon," she began, her voice softer than she intended. She cleared her throat and looked up, meeting his steady gaze. "May I ask a question I have no right to ask?" He did not flinch or look away. He simply watched her, waiting. A lesser man might have bristled at the forwardness of it, but his expression was one of patient curiosity. He gave a single, small nod. "It's the flowers," she said, feeling her way through the words. "Every Friday. I was just wondering, why?" The air in the shop seemed to still. The ticking of the clock on the wall became loud in the silence. Eli looked down at the bouquet resting between them, at the vibrant colors wrapped in plain brown paper. For a long moment, Mae was sure she had overstepped, that she had shattered the simple, unspoken arrangement they had. She had turned a transaction into an interrogation. But when he looked up again, his eyes were not cold. They were filled with a distant, melancholy light. "They're for my wife," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "For Ruth. She's buried on the hill, east of town." Mae nodded slowly. This much she had known, or had guessed. "I am sorry for your loss, Mr. Harmon." "Thank you," he said. He looked back at the flowers. She never cared for roses. She said they were for people who forgot to pay attention the rest of the year. Said they were a lazy apology. But wildflowers? He paused, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. She always said wildflowers were for people who were actually looking, who saw the good things that grew in the cracks, without any help. He was not just buying flowers. He was telling his wife, week after week, that he was still looking, that he still saw. Mae felt a knot of understanding loosen in her chest. It was not just grief. It was a promise, a testament. She finally slid the bouquet across the counter toward him. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," he said simply. He placed the coins on the wood, his fingers brushing the counter. "Thank you, Mistress Calloway, for asking." And he left. The bell chimed. Mae stood in the quiet of her shop, the scent of asters and earth filling the air, and felt that something had fundamentally shifted. The space between them was no longer just a counter and a shop. It was something more. The next Friday, when Eli came, Mae had his bouquet ready. It was a mix of the usual wildflowers, but tucked into the center of the bunch, almost hidden, were 3 sprigs of dried lavender. Its clean, calming scent was a subtle undertone to the sharper smell of the asters. She had a small stock of it she kept for sachets, and something, an instinct, a feeling she could not name had told her to add it. He paid his coins and took the bouquet. He paused at the door, his back to her, and lifted the flowers slightly, as if to catch their scent. He stood there for a full 10 seconds before he turned his head, not quite looking at her but acknowledging her. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and was gone. He noticed. A week later, he came again. After she handed him the flowers, this time also with lavender, he did not turn to leave right away. She liked lavender, he said, looking at the small sprigs. Used to put it in the linen chest. Said it kept the memory of summer in the sheets through winter. Mae's heart gave a small, quiet leap. I just thought it might be a nice addition, she said, trying to keep her tone matter of fact. It is, he said. He hesitated. It's a fine day for a walk. The air is clear. It was an observation, not an invitation. But it felt like the door being pushed open another inch. Yes, it is, Mae replied. The view from up on that hill must be something. He met her eyes then, a directness in his gaze that was new. You're welcome to see for yourself sometime, if you've a mind to. And so it began. The next Friday, after he bought the flowers, Mae untied her apron, turned the sign on the door to closed, and put on her shawl. She did not say a word, and neither did he. They simply walked out of the shop and up the street together, he with the bouquet in his hand, she with her hands clasped in front of her. The walk to the cemetery was quiet at first. The silence between them was different now, no longer the silence of strangers but the expectant silence of two people on the verge of a conversation. The hill was steeper than it looked from town. As they climbed, the sounds of Millridge faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of the wind in the tall, dry grass and the crunch of their boots on the path. Ruth's grave was on a gentle slope facing east, marked by a simple stone of gray granite. The inscription was plain, Ruth Harmon, beloved wife, 1858 to 1881. The ground around it was tidy, free of weeds. Eli knelt and removed the old faded flowers from a small clay jar sunk into the earth and placed the new ones in. The purples and yellows were brilliant against the gray stone and the brown grass. He remained kneeling for a moment, his head bowed. Mae stood a respectful distance away, looking out over the rolling plains that stretched to the horizon. She felt like an intruder, yet he had invited her. She was a witness to his private ritual. After a long silence, he stood and brushed the dirt from his knees. She would have liked you, he said, his voice low. You're a quiet person. She always said quiet people had the most to say. Mae smiled faintly. Or they're just better listeners. Both, I expect, he said, and he began to talk. He spoke of Ruth not in hushed, reverent tones, but with a kind of fond, living warmth. He told Mae that the spot they were standing on was where Ruth had declared they would build their house one day, before they'd even raised the walls of the first cabin down below. She'd wanted to wake up with the sun filling the window. Over the following weeks, their Friday walk became a new ritual. Winter settled in, and the walks became colder, the wind sharper. Mae wore a heavier cloak, and Eli's breath plumed in the air. But they still went. And every time, Mae learned another piece of the woman buried under the snow. She learned that Ruth had hated the taste of carrots but planted them anyway because Eli liked them. She learned that Ruth had a terrible singing voice but sang anyway, loudly and off-key, whenever she was kneading bread. She learned that Ruth had a collection of novels with her margin notes scribbled in delicate handwriting, sharp, witty observations that made Eli smile when he recounted them. One afternoon, Eli brought one of the books with him, a worn copy of Middlemarch. He opened it to a random page. "Listen to this," he said, and pointed to a note beside a passage about Mr. Casaubon. Ruth had written, This man is a walking library of dusty opinions. A woman would die of thirst living in his shade. Mae laughed, a genuine, surprised sound. She sounds wonderful. She was, Eli said, his gaze soft as he looked at the book. She had strong opinions, especially on flowers. She despised carnations, called them the pompous cousins of the wildflower family. Mae found herself picturing this woman she had never met. She could see her, a vivid presence with a quick laugh and sharp eyes, a woman who left notes in books and had theories on flowers. Through Eli's stories, Ruth became a third person on their walks, a warm and welcome ghost. Mae was not just learning about Eli's past, she was being entrusted with it. And in sharing his memories of Ruth, Eli was slowly, carefully sharing himself. He was not just the quiet rancher anymore. He was a man who had loved deeply, a man who could remember the precise, funny words his wife had written in a book years ago. Spring arrived, melting the snow and turning the hills a tender, vibrant green. The first true wildflowers began to appear, and Mae's bouquets became more lush. Their conversations on the hill shifted. Eli started asking Mae about herself, about the town she came from, about how she'd learned so much about plants, about the family she'd had. She told him about her father, a botanist who had taught her the Latin names for every tree in their Ohio town, and about the quiet life she and her late husband had shared before illness took him. They discovered a shared landscape of loss, but they did not linger there. They found a quiet comfort in the fact of it, a mutual understanding that needed no words. The silence between them now was easy and full. It was the silence of two people sitting on a porch, watching a sunset, content in the simple fact of the other's presence. One Friday in May, as they were walking back toward town, the scent of lilac heavy in the air, Eli pointed to her shop. "You've made a real place for yourself here, Mistress Calloway. The town looks out for you." "It does," Mae agreed, "and I'm grateful for it. That window of yours," he went on, a thoughtful look on his face, "it's become a part of the street, like the post office sign or the bell at the church. A landmark." Mae felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was the highest form of praise from a man like Eli Harmon. It was an acknowledgement not just of her business, but of her belonging. She had put down roots, and he had noticed. The summer deepened. The days grew long and warm. Their friendship settled into a comfortable shape, as familiar as the Friday ritual that had started it. The town had noticed their walks, of course. There were knowing glances from the mercantile owner, a friendly but curious smile from the blacksmith's wife. Mae ignored them. What she and Eli shared felt too quiet and too personal to be the subject of town gossip. It was theirs. In August, a letter arrived. It came on the morning stagecoach, enclosed in a thick, cream-colored envelope with the name of a Denver wholesaler embossed in the corner. Mae opened it with a sense of trepidation. The letter was an offer. The wholesaler, Mr. Thompson, had heard of her shop and was impressed by its reputation, which had apparently traveled further than she'd imagined. He was proposing a partnership. He could supply her with a vast array of flowers from all over the country, roses from the east, orchids from greenhouses, exotic ferns. He could help her expand, put in a larger glass window, perhaps even hire an assistant. The letter lay on her counter for a week. Mae read it a dozen times. It was everything a small business owner should want. It was a path to prosperity, to security. It was a validation of her hard work. But every time she thought of it, a feeling of unease settled in her stomach. Her shop would no longer be a place of local wildflowers and quiet contemplation. It would become a proper business, full of orders and ledgers and flowers that had never known Wyoming soil. It would be louder, busier. It would be a shop Ruth Harmon would have hated. She found herself staring at a blank sheet of paper, a pen in her hand, trying to compose a reply. She wrote a dozen drafts, accepting, declining, asking for more time. None of them felt right. The opportunity was a door opening, but she was afraid of what was on the other side. She was afraid of what she might lose. The next Friday, Eli noticed her distraction immediately. She was quieter than usual, her movements less certain as she arranged his bouquet. He said nothing in the shop, but on their walk up the hill, he finally spoke. "You've got something weighing on you, Mae." It was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded natural, right? She stopped on the path and looked at him. The worry she had been holding inside her all week seemed to spill out. "I received a letter," she said, and she told him everything. About the Denver wholesaler, the offer to expand, the roses and the orchids. He listened patiently, his gaze fixed on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, looking out over the valley. "It's a good offer," he said finally. "A man would be a fool to say it isn't." "I know," she said, her voice small, "but I can't seem to write the letter back. I don't know what to say." She hesitated. "I keep thinking, what would Ruth say about a shop full of hothouse roses?" Eli turned to look at her, a serious expression in his eyes. "Ruth would have said it's your shop, not hers. She would have said a person has to build their own house, not live in the one someone else designed." He took a step closer. "She's been gone for 3 years, Mae. I've spent that time talking to her memory. But you're standing right here." He reached out and gently took the blank letter and envelope she had, unbeknownst to herself, been twisting in her hands. "You're afraid," he said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. "So was I, when I first put a plow to this land. You write your letter, Mae. You write what you want for your life. And you send it. Whatever you decide, you do it without looking back." His words were like a steady hand on her shoulder. He was not telling her what to do. He was telling her to be brave enough to choose. That evening, Mae sat at the small desk in the back of her shop. She looked at the blank page, and she thought about what Eli had said. What you want for your life. She thought of her quiet shop, the scent of wildflowers, the simple rhythm of her days. She thought of the walks up the hill, the shared silences, the feeling of rightness when Eli stood beside her. The Denver offer was a future, yes, but it was not her future. She dipped her pen in the ink and began to write. It was a polite, firm refusal. She thanked Mr. Thompson for his generous offer, but explained that she was content with her business as it was. Her hand did not tremble. When she was finished, she sealed the envelope and felt a profound sense of peace. She saw Eli in town the next day. He was loading supplies into his wagon outside the mercantile. She walked over to him. "I sent the letter," she said. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "And?" "I told him no." A slow smile spread across his face. It transformed his usually solemn features, making him look younger. "Good," he said. "I wasn't asking what Ruth would have said this time," Mae told him, her heart beating a little faster. She had to say it. She had to be as brave as he had told her to be. "I'm asking what you want, Eli." The smile faded from his face, replaced by an expression of deep, unguarded seriousness. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw 100 unspoken conversations, 100 shared walks, 100 moments of quiet understanding. The air between them grew thick with everything they had not said. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "I need to take a walk," he said finally, his voice rough. "Alone." She nodded, understanding. "I'll be at the shop." He left his wagon where it was and walked away, not toward the hill, but out toward the open country, his long strides eating up the ground. Mae did not see him for the rest of the day or the next. The following Friday came, the day of their ritual. The morning passed, then the afternoon. Eli did not appear. Mae's heart, which had felt so certain, began to ache with a quiet dread. Perhaps she had pushed too hard. Perhaps she had mistaken shared grief for the beginning of something else. She stayed in her shop until dusk, long after she usually closed, hoping to hear the chime of the bell. It remained silent. That night, she did not sleep well. She lay awake, listening to the sounds of the town settling into darkness, and felt a loneliness that was sharper and more painful than any she had known since her first days in Millridge. The next morning, a Saturday, she rose early. She opened her shop with a heavy heart, the scent of the flowers offering little comfort. She was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door chimed. Eli stood there. He was not wearing his work clothes. He was dressed in a clean shirt and his good trousers. His hair was combed, and he was clean-shaven. He held his hat in his hands. He looked as if he were on his way to church. "I took my walk," he said, his voice steady. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I went up the hill this morning, before the sun was up." Mae waited, her hands still on the counter. "I've been talking to Ruth for 3 years, Mae, telling her I was still looking for the good things, just like she taught me. I thought that's all my life was going to be. Just remembering." He took a breath, his gaze locked on hers. "This morning, I wasn't talking to her. I was telling her goodbye. Not goodbye to the memory of her. Never that. But goodbye to the life that was just about her." He walked slowly toward the counter until he was standing where he always stood on Fridays. But this time there were no flowers between them. "You asked me what I want," he said. "I want to stop walking up that hill alone. I want to build a house where the sun comes in the window. I want to have supper with someone who sings off-key. I want a life that's not about looking back anymore." He paused, and his voice, when he spoke again, was simple and clear, stripped of all artifice. "I would like to stay, Mae, as your husband, if you'll have me." The breath she had been holding left her in a quiet rush. The relief was so profound it almost buckled her knees. She looked at this good, steady man, at the earnest hope in his eyes, and a slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. "Eli Harmon," she said, her voice filled with a gentle, humorous warmth. "You certainly got there. I'm a slow man, Mae." "I know," she said. "Yes. Obviously, yes." Their courtship was as quiet and natural as everything that had come before it. It consisted of shared meals at the small table in the back of her shop, of Sunday walks that no longer ended at the cemetery but wandered along the creek, of Eli helping her unload a shipment of clay pots, his large, sure hands so careful with the fragile items. They talked of real things, of the price of cattle and the best time to plant peonies, of their hopes for the small house he planned to build on the eastern slope, of the future they would now build together. The town watched with a quiet, collective approval. Their union felt right, earned. It felt like a story that had finally found its proper ending, or rather, its proper beginning. They were married a month later, on a bright Saturday in early autumn, the same time of year she had first dared to ask him why. The ceremony was not in the church. It was in her shop, which she had filled with every wildflower she could find. The air was thick with their scent. The blacksmith and his wife stood as their witnesses, and the mercantile owner's family crowded in the back. Mae wore a simple blue dress, the color of the lupine that grew on the hills, and in her hands she held not a formal bouquet, but a small, hand-picked bunch of asters and yarrow, tied with a sprig of lavender. Eli stood beside her, his solidity a comforting presence. When the justice of the peace pronounced them man and wife, Eli did not kiss her with a flourish. He simply took her hand, his calloused thumb stroking the back of her fingers, and looked at her with a promise in his eyes that was more powerful than any public gesture. It was a promise of shared sunrises, of quiet companionship, of a life to be built, one steady day at a time. 5 years later, the house stood on the eastern slope, its windows facing the rising sun, just as Ruth had once dreamed, and just as Mae and Eli had planned. It was a solid, well-built home, smelling of fresh-cut pine and baking bread. The porch faced out over the vast expanse of Wyoming, and it was here that they often sat in the evenings, watching the sky fade from blue to purple to a deep, star-dusted black. One evening in late summer, Mae sat in a rocking chair, a mending basket in her lap. Eli was next to her, cleaning a piece of harness leather, the scent of the oil familiar and comforting. A small girl of 4, with her father's steady blue eyes and her mother's quiet smile, played on the porch steps, arranging a collection of smooth stones into a careful pattern. They had named her Hope. Eli finished his work and set the leather aside. He looked at his wife, at the way the fading light caught the soft lines of her face. He reached over and took her hand, his touch as familiar as his own heartbeat. She looked up from her mending and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I was just thinking," he said, his voice a low rumble, "that I never did thank you properly." "For what?" "For asking," he said. "For paying attention." Earlier that day, while walking the pasture, he had found a patch of late-blooming Indian paintbrush. He had picked a handful and brought them into the house, placing them in a simple glass jar on the kitchen table. It was not Friday. It was just a Tuesday. He had done it without thinking, a simple gesture of affection. Mae leaned her head against his shoulder. The crickets were starting their evening song, and a cool breeze drifted up from the valley. From inside the house, they could smell the lavender sachet Mae had placed in the linen closet, a quiet echo of a conversation that had started long ago in a little shop filled with wildflowers. It was a good life, built not on forgetting the past, but on the quiet, steady courage to build a new future beside it. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound love stories are not found in grand declarations, but in the simple, patient act of looking for the good things that grow in the cracks, and in having someone to share them with